Good evening. Thank you all for joining this, what I'm hoping will be an exciting and certainly interesting and informative webinar. If I could just, we will start, I will probably repeat this again in a few seconds. I'm John Hayward-Cripps, the Chief Executive of Neighbourhood Watch Network, and I'm joined and absolutely delighted that Christopher Budd, the Global Senior Threat Communications Manager from Avast, will be presenting this seminar on Don't Get Hooked by Scammers. What I would ask everyone to do is to please turn off your cameras and keep your microphones muted during the course of this, so that will reduce the reduce any potential noise or interference with the signal. I've got a couple of sounds from people saying that they can't hear. I'm also getting people saying that they're fine with the sound. So I hope the sound is okay now. It says it's okay now, so that sounds good. I think we'll just wait a minute or so, or 30 seconds before I pass over to Christopher. All I'm hearing now is that the sound is fine, which is great. So again, welcome to this evening's webinar. As I just mentioned, my name is John Hayward-Cripps, and this is a webinar from Neighbourhood Watch Network. I'd ask everyone please to turn off their cameras during the webinar, as it reduces the chance of interference on the webinar, and we will keep everyone's microphones muted. If we can do that, that would be great. So without further ado, I'm really delighted to invite Christopher Budd, as I said, who's the Global Senior Threat Communications Manager from Avast, to present this webinar on behalf of Neighbourhood Watch Network and Avast, who you know are one of our partners. So over to you, Christopher.
Great, thank you so much. Good evening, welcome everyone. Thank you for taking some time on your Friday evening to be with us here. As John said, my name is Christopher Budd. I'm the Global Senior Threat Communications Manager with Avast, and I'm here to talk with you all today about Flubot and phishing scams. The name of our session, as John said, is Don't Get Hooked by Scammers, which is a bit of a play on words on the whole idea of phishing. So I'll be talking with you today about Flubot and about phishing scams, and I'll move on to the next slide here. There we go. Before we dive in, I'll give you a little bit of background about myself. So I have been in technology for about 25 years, believe it or not. I've been in security for 20 years. In security, we always talk about this as being like dog years. So that means I have about 140 years in security. I was with the Microsoft Security Response Center up here in Washington State, where I live, for 10 years. After that, I've been with several major security companies for 10 years. As I said, I live in Washington State, and I have interests in travel and languages, among other things. Sorry, one second, bit of a hiccup with the slides here. So here's what we are going to be covering today. So we're going to start off by talking about what is Flubot. That was pretty much the driver for having this session, because Flubot was in the news in the UK and really around the world in the spring and summer. And we're going to take that and then move on and talk more generally about phishing scams, because Flubot is a phishing scam. Then we'll talk about how phishing scams work. Most important part, how you can protect against scams. And I always try to do this by giving first non-technical tips, because those are things that are easiest for people to remember and do, and then some technical tips. Then we'll talk about what to do if you think that you're being scammed. And then finally, we'll be moving on to what is really my favorite part of these, the question and answer session. And we've got at least 15 minutes in the agenda for questions and answers. So if you have any questions that come up while we're talking, please, please remember them, and don't hesitate to bring them on. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in. So Flubot, you may have heard about Flubot. I've got on the screen screenshot from the BBC's news page from a story that they did in April of 2021, Flubot warning over major Android package delivery scam. We saw an incredible number of Flubot out there in the spring. I believe there's still some circulating out there into the summer, but it was widespread enough that it really brought the question of text message scams back to people's minds. And that's really what brings us here today is to start with. So what is Flubot? So Flubot was a text message phishing campaign, like I said, in spring and summer of 2021. What it did was it uses fake shipping text messages with links. If you were to click on the link in the message, that it would have taken you to another website. That website would offer a malicious download that was specifically written for Android phones. And that malicious download, once installed, would steal your contacts so that the attackers could turn around and send the same text messages to those contacts. It can also raise fake windows, little pop-ups on your phone that could steal information like your banking credentials. We know, for instance, that people who had Flubot would later, after being infected, navigate to, say, their mobile banking site. The window would pop up to log in. They would think it was their legitimate site's login when in fact it was the attacker's fake windows. They would enter their information, it would go off to the attackers, and bad financial things would happen. Another thing with Flubot that was particularly pernicious is it was very good at making itself hard to remove. It actually used some of the capabilities of Android to hide itself within the phone so that you could not easily delete it like you can delete apps. It even went so far as to abuse some of the accessibility features, the features that make it easier, for instance, to see the screen if you have impaired vision, to literally make it so that when you would try to uninstall it, it would move the window that you would tap on to uninstall it. It was actually quite clever in a devious sort of way. The UK's National Security Cyber Centre, NCSC, actually put out an advisory on Flubot, and I've gone ahead and included the link to that. It's a very good advisory, and if you need information on Flubot, I certainly recommend that you take a look at that. So I wanted to go ahead and try and make things real for our presentation. And so here is an example of what people who got Flubot actually saw. So on this, you can see it pretends to come from the global shipping company DHL. And it says your parcel is arriving, track here, and then has a long and confusing URL. You'll notice that there's no way on there to tell who it's coming from. And it relies on your trust that that DHL is a company that you trust for you to see this and want to take action. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the things that you can look for in messages that that will help you understand that you're looking at spam. So what are phishing scams? So let's take Flubot, because Flubot was an example of phishing. And now let's talk about phishing more broadly, because one of the things that I really want to do in this session is help you understand not just what Flubot is, because to a degree, Flubot has kind of come and gone, but to understand phishing more generally so that you can better protect yourself. So first of all, let's talk about the name, phishing. Why is it called that? Because what the attackers try to do is they basically try to phish. They basically put bait out there and they try to hook victims. The term phishing has been around for decades now, and it's a pretty apt term when you look at how it works. As far as why it has a PH rather than an F, you know, people in my industry like to be clever. That's about the only explanation I can come up with. It's been phishing for as long as I can recall. But what phishing is at its heart is unsolicited communication that is posing as trusted entities. You know, It is stuff that you get through a number of possible channels that pose as something coming from someone that you trust with an eye to getting you to give over personal information, financial information, things like that. Over the years, we've seen shipping companies like DHL, for instance, impersonated. We see financial institutions, utility companies, virtual currency exchanges are currently popular because of how much Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies have been in the news. We do sometimes see people imitating government entities. So for instance, at the height of COVID last year, when the UK government was talking about stimulus checks for people, we saw phishing emails that would use the government's logos to as part of messages that would be talking about stimulus checks. They were fake. They were using this because they knew that people were aware that stimulus checks would be coming, and the attackers wanted to capitalize on the trust that people have in the government. Phishing comes in a variety of formats. So I think by this point, everyone's pretty familiar with email messages as a means for phishing. Flubot is an example of text or SMS messages. Within the industry, that's sometimes called smishing, which is a portmanteau of SMS and phishing, also perhaps one of the ugliest sounding words in my industry. But text messages are used for phishing. We also see phishing websites, obviously. We've seen phone calls being used for phishing, and believe it or not, even voicemail messages. So the key thing in all of this is, once again, it's unsolicited. It's attackers that are trying to use the trust that you have in the perceived sender to get you to take actions that you might not otherwise take. And what they're really trying to do is get access to your information, to your computers or your mobile devices, and your money. So how do phishing scams work? A key thing with all of them, and this is an important thing to remember, they all use fear and high pressure tactics to make you act right away. Across the board within security, we see attackers use fear and high pressure tactics because they're good psychologists. They know that when we are afraid, that when we are rushed, we don't make the best decisions. And so one of the first things to be mindful of when you're looking to protect yourself against phishing is to think to yourself, is this something that's trying to use fear or a high pressure tactic? Because if it is, there's a good chance that it's a phishing message. Like I said, one of the ways that phishing propagates is through emails and text messages. And like I said, they're made to look like they come from trusted companies. They're going to try and use legitimate logos, which are very easy to copy off of websites to make you think that they're legitimate. These messages also are going to have links in them or attachments that will take you to websites. So this is another key thing that we'll come back to for how to protect yourself. Phishing messages are inherently easy to fake, and it's important to remember that email and text messages, they really are not secure methods of communication. Unfortunately, the reality is 20 years into the internet, we have not done a good job of making email messages, and especially text messages, believable in terms of being sure that what you're looking at was actually sent by who you think sent it. So, an important thing to remember when you're dealing with email and text messages is that they're fundamentally pretty insecure. And text messages especially, and we'll come back to this on the next slide in a little more detail, but text messages are even less secure than email messages. And email messages are pretty not secure. So you should have a high degree of caution when you're dealing with text messages. just for the sake of thoroughness, because we're talking about all phishing right now, websites, again, these are made to look like they come from trusted companies. Over the years, we have found that attackers are very good at copying legitimate websites. I was doing research, for instance, a year ago during COVID on phishing websites, and there was one that was mimicking the Canadian government's COVID information site, and it was a very good imitation of the legitimate website. They had copied the main page, they had copied the structure of the site, they'd even copied down to about 3 levels within the website. So we know that the attackers out there are very good copycats. Another thing with phishing to be aware of is that sometimes you can end up on a phishing website even though you went to a legitimate website. There's a problem out there that we call malvertising, M-A-L advertising. It's a portmanteau of malicious advertising. And malvertising is a way that attackers can hijack legitimate ads on legitimate sites to direct you to their websites. So that's another vector to be aware of and cautious of. And very briefly, since I mentioned that you can actually have phishing phone calls and voicemails, one thing that is interesting when we talk about phishing through phone calls is these are run actually out of professional quality call centers these days. We've seen inside of these call centers, we see that they're set up with hundreds of people. They have their own desk. They have, maybe not their own cubicle, but their own workspace. They use scripts that have been developed and are honed for their effectiveness. And they use the same sort of dialing systems that professional call centers use. So when we look at phishing phone calls, we can see that we are dealing with fairly sophisticated and well-funded attackers out there. Now, when I was talking a moment ago about text messages, I said I would talk more about how text messages in particular can be dangerous. And I want to go into that a little bit more. So the way text messages work, the way the technology was developed, there's no other way to put it except to say there really is no security built into text messages. Now, another thing to be mindful of, and we saw this in the example, and I have another example for you in a moment, text messages are plain text and links only. So when we look at it in comparison, for instance, to email messages, you don't have logos, you don't have any of the things that you have in email that can give you tips on the legitimacy or illegitimacy of the message. Related to that and related to the technology, there's actually no way for you to verify the sender. Now, with email, there are sometimes ways that you can verify the sender, and more importantly, the people that handle email messages, the technology companies, have technology that they use between them that can be used to help verify that messages are more or less legitimate. We just don't have that with text messages. Text messages are a very insecure format. It's made even worse by the fact that these are going to come from phone numbers that are almost always unrecognizable. When I get legitimate text messages from companies like Amazon or shippers like UPS, for instance, in the United States, even when they're legitimate, they are coming to me from phone numbers that I have never seen before and may well never see again. And so there's simply no way, when you look at a text message and the phone number, to easily tell that this is a legitimate message versus a spam or phishing message. Another thing with text messages is they're actually really easy to forge because, again, they're just plain text and they're just links. And the message structure on the technology side is very simple. Another reason that text message phishing is more dangerous these days is people are aware that phishing comes in email, not many people are necessarily aware that they can get them through text messages. I've said that text messages are less secure than email. A lot of people believe the opposite because they don't hear about problems with text messages the way they do with email. So while text messaging is a less secure messaging format, a lot of people are less cautious with text messages than they are with email. And finally, mobile numbers are easy to find these days. They're often lost in data breaches. They're often posted on social media sites with no protection. And so it's easy for attackers to go out, gather up phone numbers, collect them into big bunches and sell them. And so, this is one of the reasons why we see more and more text message spam and phishing these days. So with that in mind, I thought it might be helpful, maybe a little interesting, if I gave you a couple of real world examples of first text message phishing and then email phishing. And when I say real world examples, I mean these are real world examples. These are two examples that I myself got 2 nights ago. In fact, if you look closely at the timestamps on the 2 examples, you'll see, funnily enough, I got these within about 5 minutes of each other. I was working on the slides for this session when I got them, and I decided that at the very least, these might be good real world examples. And so maybe we can turn something bad into something good. So this is a message that I got on my phone, my personal phone, actually, this one right here, in fact, at 9:29 2 nights ago. My phone buzzed, I looked down, and I saw this on my screen. Now, right out of the gate, you can see it comes from a phone number. There's no name attached to it because it's a text message. And I've actually gone through on here and marked this up to indicate some of the thinking that I went through when I saw this. So my phone buzzed, I looked at it. First thing I looked at was the phone number 929. Not a phone number I recognize. Actually, I can't tell you what area code 929 in the United States is either, but it's not a number I recognize. Looking at the message, so it says, "Thank you for being a Venmo user. You have been selected to receive a free gift worth at least $100 for a 5-minute survey." And then we have the URL that they want me to click. This is fairly typical of what we see with, especially with text message spam. In this case, rather than using fear, they're actually trying to appeal to my greed. They want me to get $100 for 5 minutes, and frankly, who wouldn't want $100 for a 5-minute survey? But looking through, you'll see it says, "Thank you for being a Venmo user." Well, for me personally, that was the next tip. I deleted my Venmo account several months ago because I didn't use it and I don't need that security exposure. So that was tip off number 2, that this is fake. Tip off number 3, we look at the big URL that's in the text message, and it goes to trespassbactivity.com. Last time I checked, that is not a Venmo domain. It doesn't say venmo.com. It's not a Venmo URL. In fact, I don't recognize that at all. So that is a website that I have no clue what it is. So obviously I did not click through, at least not initially. I did decide, however, to go ahead and click through to see where it took me so that I could get the image for where it went for our presentation today. So this is where it took me. Let me emphasize, do not try this at home. I made an informed professional security decision to go there so that I could use it for this. I would not normally go there, but I thought it would be interesting for us to see where this would go. And when I would click on the URL, I got my next tip off that this is fake, because what I saw happen is it took me to a website in my browser website didn't load. Then that website forwarded me to a second website. And then that website, which again didn't load, took me to this one. So we had 2 forwards before we got to the final website. That forwarding is a common attacker trick that we see around spam and phishing. So another thing just to be mindful of, if you do click on links and you start seeing, you go to one destination, then it takes you to another, then to another, that's a huge, huge tip off that you're being taken to a malicious site. But looking at where it did take me, it took me to mydreamsarereal.ru. So that is, for me as a security person, another tip off. .ru is the top level domain for Russia. Last time I checked, Venmo is not based in Russia. I'm not a Russian Venmo user, so there is no reason whatsoever for me to be on a Russian website when we're talking about Venmo. The other thing that they did on here, which I've highlighted, is a classic time pressure trick. When you land on the site, you see that it says time remaining and there's a countdown. And as you are on the site, that's actually counting down. Again, as I said earlier, the attackers like to use high pressure tactics. They know that you're going to make less good decisions when you are under pressure like that. And so in this case, they are using a countdown timer to make you think, I better click that accept button within the next 5 minutes or I won't get my $100. I did go ahead and click once more just to see where it would take me. And I don't have a screenshot for that, but I can tell you that the next page that I went to, it asked me to tell them what kind of Venmo account I had. I stopped then. I'm brave. I'm not that brave. But this was clearly an example of text message phishing. Next up, we have an example for you of email phishing. And again, just like with the last one, I've gone through and highlighted the things that I look at just as a security person, things that helped tip me off. So again, as I mentioned, within, about 5 minutes of getting the text message, I got this in my inbox. It was a busy night for me for phishing, I guess. First thing we notice is the subject line, which says account usage 9:36 p.m. It's a clever subject line, but I'm a Microsoft customer. I worked for them for 10 years. I know the subject lines that they use for their official account related communications. It's not that. I'll also call out that you see they've got 9:36 p.m., which is actually the correct time that I received it. That's another clever tactic that the attackers are using to make it seem legitimate. In this case, to make it seem like this is some sort of immediate real-time notification. The next tip-off for me is the sender information, which has my email domain name, because my email domain is christopherbud.com. It's got my email domain name in it. And then you can see the actual email address, paulpeachy@copsltd.com. Neither of those are mine. I don't recognize any of that. Again, a fake. Next, we see that they're trying to make this look like an Office 365 service announcement. Now, this one is a little bit trickier because I do actually use Office 365. So this is an example of one that could be applicable to me, unlike, say, the Venmo one. But again, there's no logo on there. This is not what official Microsoft communications looks like. And then our last big tip off at the bottom, it has terrible formatting problems. Just, the email is practically unreadable because of the formatting. And that is the final and biggest tip off, that this is a low quality phishing attempt. Now, important to call out, there are high quality phishing attempts out there. So you have to be careful, and you have to go through and look at many things But the key thing is that we are talking about unsolicited communication. And so moving on now to talk about how you can protect against phishing scams. In our non-technical tips, our first and most important tip is treat all unsolicited inbound communications with caution. If you're getting a notification from Microsoft that you weren't expecting, treat it with caution. It may be phishing. Same with text messages. I treat all inbound communication with a high degree of caution. Next, don't panic and don't rush. Remember, the attackers want you to rush. They're going to do things like use that countdown clock to increase pressure on you, to make you make bad decisions quickly. You don't have to. You are in control. Don't panic and don't rush. And related to that, don't be afraid to say no and leave it. You can get incoming emails or incoming text messages that sound scary, that make it sound like if you don't take action right now, very bad things will happen. You don't have to do what they tell you. You can set it aside and say, I'm going to check this using legitimate methods. I'm not going to click on the links, and take your time doing that. Across the board, don't give personal or financial information out to websites, to phone callers, over text messages, unless you are doing so in a conversation, for instance, on the telephone that you have initiated. Another tip that is good to remember, don't give bank account or debit card information when you are shopping, for instance, online. Use credit cards. And the reason for that is the personal protections that you get with credit cards are better than those that you get with bank accounts and debit cards. You have better protection to dispute transactions in fraud situations. When we talk about bank account or debit card situations, those are the accounts that we hear the worst horror stories around. Those are the ones where we hear about people's life savings, for instance, being drained. So use credit cards rather than bank and debit card info. Another key non-technical tip, trust your instincts. If it doesn't feel right, stop it. And this comes back to don't panic and don't rush, and also back to don't be afraid to say no and leave it. If something just doesn't feel right, you can stop it, you can leave it, you can initiate a conversation with, say, your bank. Let's say you get a phishing email that comes in and it pretends to be from your bank and you're worried that it could be legitimate. You can initiate a conversation with your bank on the phone or through their actual website on your own, using, like I said, methods that you are in control of, and be safer as you do that. The key thing here is if something just doesn't feel right, the odds are good that it's not right. And in a couple of minutes, I will take you through and help you see how you can be sure, for instance, that you are navigating to the correct legitimate website, say for a bank. Moving on to our technical tips. First and foremost, keep your computer and your devices and your apps all up to date. The reality is that we are finding problems in operating systems, in computers, in apps all the time that need to be updated to protect them from attackers. So keeping your computer and your devices up to date is really critical. This also means making sure that you're running operating systems and using devices that are being supported to be up to date. So for instance, if you're running something with Windows XP on your computer, please go out and get a new computer. Windows XP is no longer supported, and it's very easy for attackers to attack that. Another good tip is to run good security software. Full disclosure, I work for Avast, and we make good free antivirus. Others do too. So please go ahead and get yourself good security software. Next, don't click on links that you get in emails or text messages. We talked about how the attackers will use links to take you from the phishing email, from the phishing text message to the malicious websites. We saw this on the real world example that I gave you. So don't click links. If you need to go to a website to say, check on the status of a shipment, just go ahead and navigate to it directly on your computer yourself. Don't click on the links. Also, don't open attachments from unknown, untrusted people. Another trick that the attackers use is they will put attachments in phishing messages, and those attachments will have links. Sometimes those attachments will also try to install malware on your system. So if you get something that is unexpected, that, for instance, says, here is an invoice, don't open that attachment. Excuse me. Thank you. You should also be careful with attachments from people you know. I sometimes will get emails that I don't expect from someone that I know. It has an attachment. I'll call them or connect to them through a chat application and just say, hey, Bob, did you just send me this email with this attachment? And if they say they did, then I know that I can trust it because I trust Bob, and all is good. But there's nothing wrong with taking an extra step and checking where attachments are concerned. Moving on to mobile devices, and this relates back to Flubot, for instance. Only install apps from known legitimate app stores. So for instance, the Google Play Store or the Apple App Store. One of the things with Flubot is when people clicked on the link, it took them to a website, and that website wanted the people to install the app from that website. If you only install apps from known legitimate sites, then you're not going to install that app from Flubot and you would be protected. For those who are more comfortable with more technical depth, there is on Android something called Google Play Support, or sorry, Google Play Protect. And I've got a link on there for where you can go and learn more about that. And then, like I've said, most importantly, go to websites by typing the address yourself and verifying those websites. So again, don't click on links, go ahead and navigate to the website yourself. And so what do I mean by verifying? And this is another real world example. So what I have on the screen here is an example of what I do when I go to websites. So let's say I wanted to go to the actual Microsoft site and be sure that I'm talking with it. So you can see the URL in the on the screen here, support.microsoft.com. So I type that in. Next, I look for the lock. So you can see there's a little lock to the left of the URL. I click on that. It gives me the box that you see that says the connection is secure, and you see the word certificate. So we go ahead and we select certificate. Certificate for websites is kind of like a driver's permit. It's something that you can use to verify the actual identity of the website that you're talking about. And what we're doing here is basically asking the website to present that to us so that we can take a look at it, check it, and verify that it is the site that we think we are talking with. So when you click on certificate on this next screen, you can see it's going to bring up the certificate. So it brings up the driver's license. We take a look at it and we can see there, as I've highlighted, that in this conversation, we are talking to support.microsoft.com. That is the verified actual website that we are talking with. This is something that you can do, and frankly should do, for pretty much any website that you ever enter sensitive information on. So for instance, if you're going to your banking website, you can do exactly what I've outlined here. Click on the lock, click on certificate, have the certificate come up, look at the URL, and see that you are talking with the banking website that you want to be talking with. Kind of starting to wrap up here, before we move to question and answer. So what to do if you think you're being scammed? So first of all, stop everything right away. Okay. So if you think you've gotten down the path of falling for a scam, you can always stop at any point. So you can go ahead, close the browser window. Sometimes with phishing websites, for instance, it can be hard to close that browser window. If that's the case, shut down the computer or shut down the phone. If you've got someone that's calling for phone phishing, just hang up. And frankly, don't be afraid to be rude. You know, if someone is trying to scam you, there's nothing wrong with just hanging up on them. It's, you know, they're the rude ones. They're trying to scam you. With email messages and text messages, you can delete it or you can flag it as spam or phishing. In the UK, you can forward the message for text messages. You can forward the message to 7726. That is a free spam reporting service that's provided by phone operators in the UK. If you have given payment information and you think there's a scam underway, go ahead and call your financial institution right away. Financial institutions have very robust professional anti-fraud divisions. If you call them and say, I think I might have given my credit card out on a phishing site, they will work very quickly and very effectively to help you with that. If you should find that you are dealing with tech support type phishing messages, for instance, and you need technical help because you think there is actually something wrong with your system, you can get technical help from legitimate companies that you verify. And again, let's go back to the steps that I outlined for how you check the legitimacy of a website. And like I said, there are phishing messages that highlight tech support as an angle. So be aware of that. Finally, if you think you're the victim of a scam, you can file a complaint with the National Cybersecurity Center, the NCSC in the UK, and you just go to report.ncsc.gov.uk and they can help you. Finally, in closing, we've got some knowledge resources here. At Avast, we have what we call the Avast Academy, and that is a website with information that explains things like what is malware, how you can stop spam text messages, what is ransomware, and these are written for regular people, and so these are a really good resource. And with that, let's go ahead and move on to question and answer. Thank you, everyone, for putting up with my 45 minutes of droning on, but I'm looking forward to any questions you've got.
Thank you, Christopher. I have to say, I don't think you were droning on at all, and I found that absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much for all your time. I have collated some of the questions, so I'm happy to pass them on to you.
Sure.
One of the first questions we got was whether Flubot does affect iPhones as well, or if it's just an Android that are at risk to that.
Sure. So the Flubot campaign was focused on Android only. Now, here's a key thing. The messages you could get Flubot messages on an iPhone, but the malicious software, the malware, would only run on Android.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And another question, I guess this is quite a general question, was about how do scammers get hold of phone numbers and emails?
That's a really great question. There are many ways that they can get hold of them. These days, the biggest way is through data breaches and data leaks. We hear all the time these days, unfortunately, about how websites and organizations have had data lost or stolen. And what happens is that information finds its way onto what we call the dark web, which is basically where cyber criminals will go to buy and sell malicious software. They'll also buy and sell stolen data. And so what's been happening over the years is, as data has leaked, it gets passed around, it gets built into these large scale tranches of data, and people will go and buy them. And so, basically over time, your data finds its way, after being lost or stolen, into these giant criminal databases, essentially. Another way that people get this information is unfortunately people put it out there themselves. If you put your phone number on a social media site, and that information is publicly available, it's very easy for attackers to frankly legitimately view that information, and then they can copy it, and then once again it finds its way into these databases.
Thank you, Christopher. We've had a couple of questions where people are just wanting to know a bit more about in what ways emails are insecure. I know you covered this partially in your presentation, but about emails specifically.
Sure. So at its heart, the way email has been built, there are simply no robust security protections built into email so that you can verify who the sender is. A colleague of mine once said that you should trust email about as much as you trust a postcard, because I can send a postcard to anyone, and I can make it seem like, as I write that postcard, make it seem like it's coming from someone else. And when you get that postcard, there's no way for you to know for sure who actually sent it. The same is generally true with email. There are some special cases where we can do things that will enable you to verify the sender of the email, but quite honestly, those are really complicated from a technical point of view. It's stuff that I find hard to use, and it's stuff that regular people really can't use. So across the board, your best bet is to treat email with a low level of trust. I always say, if I get an email that claims to come from my bank, for instance, that says that I need to check on something, I view that as a prod or motivation for me to go and navigate myself, like I outlined, navigate myself to that account and check on it. I will never actually click on anything that is in the email. I will just see the email and then separately go and start checking through verified means. Again, it's kind of like getting a postcard.
Thanks, Christopher. It's kind of attached to that. There was a query about if you simply by opening an email from a scammer, not necessarily clicking on a link held within it, but can just opening an email enable a scammer to have access to your computer or download malicious malware?
Sure. So that's actually not a simple yes/no answer. So this is why, and I'll explain, this is why having good security software, like I suggested, really helps. The best, most honest answer is, in most cases, simply opening an email should not be a problem. But there's a small number of cases where that is not true. When that is not true, that's where security software can come in and provide an extra layer of protection. Now, on the technical side, what's behind my answer is sometimes there are what we call vulnerabilities in software, and the act of opening an email can enable an attack against those vulnerabilities. This is also why having everything up to date is so critically important, because vulnerabilities are fixed by updates. So if you have good security software and you keep everything up to date, then the chances of something bad happening simply from opening an email are extremely low.
Thank you, Christopher. That's great. Just a question specifically on a bit of your presentation was around a question around whether the Venmo site could have been breached, or whether you thought it was just a speculative kind of round robin.
Oh, I'm not a betting person, and I would bet my farm, if I had a farm, that it was purely speculative. And that's a really great point. And actually, now that we've had the question, I wish I had emphasized this. You know, when people do phishing, when they impersonate legitimate sites, nothing bad has happened to those websites. This is people that are copying the look and the feel and the name and the logo for these sites, but there's been no data breach from those sites themselves. There's been no problem with those sites. And most importantly, you know, the people that run those sites. So going back to my example, Venmo, for instance, you know, Venmo did nothing wrong. Venmo doesn't even necessarily know that spam phishing email was out there, and there's no way for them to know. It's simply, and this brings us back to the name phishing, it's simply attackers have picked the Venmo name because they know that people recognize and trust that name. They pick that name, they put it in the message, and like a good fisherman, they cast it out, and they're waiting to see who bites.
It kind of ties into another question which you received, was around relating to an earlier part of your presentation around, do DHL or other delivery companies do anything to reduce the ability of people to be able to copy their websites, or can they even do anything about it?
That's a really great question. It's a question that doesn't have a simple answer. The simplest, most honest answer is there is very little that those companies can do, because these people are out there copying their stuff, making these phishing messages, and there's DHL, for instance, they can't stop them because in many cases they're in completely other countries. What organizations like DHL or Microsoft, for instance, when I worked at Microsoft, can do is, in their legitimate email, in their legitimate communications, provide instructions on how you can verify on their website that it's a legitimate email, and to provide information on the legitimate means that you can contact them. But at the end of the day, it's nearly impossible for someone like DHL to go out and find someone that is phishing using their information and stop them. And this problem has become so pervasive. So for instance, the bank that I use, when you use their mobile app and you go to their website, they have alert messages all over the place saying, we don't send text messages, don't respond to text messages, things like that.
Thank you. One of the other questions we got was around, if scammers do get into your phone, particularly using Flubot or other malware, does that mean that they would be able to have access to all your contacts, or their contact? They would be able to find out your contacts. And on top of that, once that's happened, is it possible for that device then to be cleaned, so to speak, and remove
Sure.
the malware?
Sure. So with Flubot in particular, the answer is absolutely yes. Flubot was designed to steal your contacts and send them to the attackers, so that the attackers could then send Flubot onto those contacts. Malware on phones regularly do steal contact information. So that's definitely something to worry about. As far as cleaning the device, for a mobile device like an Android phone, really the best thing that you can do is what we call a factory reset. Every Android phone maker has a different set of instructions, unfortunately, for how to do it. So you would need to look this up. But a factory reset takes your device and returns it to the original state that it came in when it was made. So that will delete the malware from your system. That's the good news. The bad news is that's also going to delete all the apps and all the data that you have on there. So, so it's not a step to be taken lightly. Fortunately, most phones these days will mirror the critical data to a cloud provider, say Google, for instance. So that can make it a little bit easier. But you do want to be sure before you do a hard reset.
My apologies.
Sorry, my watch just apologized. You do want to be sure that you've got all your data backed up before you do a hard reset. After you do a hard reset, like we're talking about, you are going to have to reinstall all the apps that were on the phone, and you will have to restore the data in some manner. But that is the single best way to clean a mobile device that has been infected with malware.
Thank you. One of the other questions we got was around that, can the lock on the lock symbol on websites, can that be faked, or can scammers buy us? Is it possible for scammers to buy a certificate?
That is a really good question, and so the honest answer is yes. Now this is why it's actually important to look at the certificate, because if you just go to a website and look at if there's a lock, that doesn't actually tell you what website you're talking with. And exactly to the questioner's point, we've seen attackers build malicious websites and go ahead and get the digital certificate that will make there be a lock there. What attackers cannot do, and this is how digital certificates are like a driver's license, what attackers cannot do is have a name on that certificate that is different than what the actual name of the server is. So when you bring up that certificate, even if they're trying to make it look like you're going to Microsoft.com, they cannot get a certificate that will say Microsoft.com. So that's why it's important to check that certificate.
So I guess that's a kind of double check, that making sure that the site that you believe it is, that's what the certificate is written in, and vice versa.
Yes, and this gets to something. For years in the industry, we've been telling people that you should look for the lock. Well, that's good, and people have started doing that, and that's great. But then attackers started getting their own certificates so that there would be a lock. And so now, exactly to your point, it's not enough just to look for a lock. You have to look for the lock and then check the certificate. Excuse me, I have a tickle.
Yeah, do take a drink. You've been really helpful, and lots of questions and talking. There's a very broad question here from someone that was just asked a very simple: how safe is TikTok?
So
I'm presuming that means around the security of data.
Yeah. Sorry, that's a question I wasn't expecting. So give me 1 second to think through that. Full disclosure, I don't use TikTok. I did do an analysis of it. I think the app itself is reasonably, I mean, it's a known app. I would not have concerns with having the TikTok app on my phone necessarily. It's been a while since I've looked at what information it requires, versus the information that you volunteer. I think a key thing with TikTok is that we're talking about social media, and the privacy and security concerns with social media apps relates less to the security of the app,
right,
and more to what you do with it, and how much you share through.
Yeah, and I guess that is the same for social media across the board. That the that the software and the apps themselves are relatively safe, but you need to be very careful about what you choose to share on those for all sorts of very obvious and not so obvious reasons.
Exactly. I think I did a review, for instance, of Clubhouse, which is another social media app, and that one, for instance, I think is good from a security and privacy point of view generally. But again, that just relates to the technology of the app. There's a whole host of questions related to what you do once you're in the app that are kind of outside the scope of technology.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a whole education. And again, I mean, it makes me think of when the world was first had telephones. It took some time before we worked out how to properly use them. And I don't doubt that, given the technology, there's an awful lot of that around social media and all those other things. But the pace of change is so rapid, it's hard to catch up.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I've got a final question for you, which I think hopefully you'll find interesting. And the question was just around that the internet is sometimes referred to and seems like the Wild West. And will it ever be kind of safe to the point where scammers are likely to be caught, or that will be significantly easier?
I think the simple answer is no time soon. Unfortunately, what makes the internet the Wild West in some ways is the way in which the entire world is connected to it, and we immediately run into real world legal and jurisdictional problems. You have one internet, but 200 and some countries that are connected to the internet. And one of the biggest problems that we have is it's very easy for attackers to live in one country and target people in other countries. And frankly, as long as those attackers aren't causing problems in their home country, in some countries, the authorities have very little incentive or interest in pursuing or prosecuting.
Yes, yeah, no, that's fine. I've just got one final question. I just see that someone said that sometimes they see a warning that a site is not secure, and therefore, how dangerous can it be? Should they then never access such sites?
That's actually a little tricky to answer, because I would want some more detail on where they're getting that message. I suspect what's happening here is, for instance, if you use Google Chrome today, if you go to a website that won't have that lock that we talked about, then Google Chrome will raise a message saying that the site isn't secure. What Google is trying to tell you is that you won't have an encrypted communications channel between you and that website. That in and of itself doesn't mean that the site itself isn't secure. So for instance, if let's say you're trying to go to a small community website, and they don't have SSL protection, so they don't have the lock, but the site itself is, it's just a web page with, say, like a book reading club, let's use that. That site is not inherently unsafe. What Chrome is trying to tell you is that the communications channel isn't encrypted. All that said, I think really the best way to deal with a message like that is to understand what is the site that you were trying to get to, and what could that site be trying to do. So for instance, if when you go to a site like that, you do not want to enter, say, credit card information, because it's not encrypted. But if it's a site that you're going to just for information, I don't think there's a huge risk there. The important thing is, if this is the Google Chrome message that I think it is, what it's trying to tell you is that the communications isn't protected, not that the site in and of itself is going to do bad things to you.
I think that's really helpful, Christopher, because I think, you know, I think there's something about the circumstances, as you say, of the site that you're trying to access. And if it is just, as you say, a community site that you want to just get some information of when the next meeting is of X, Y, or Z or something, that you wouldn't expect that the organization that runs that site to have security, because that, or a level of security that you'd expect,
Right.
I don't know, an international company that you're going to buy things from. They're completely different kind of concepts.
Right.
You need to apply that, I guess.
Right. And again, going back to to our technical tips, this again is where keeping your system up to date and having good security software can help, because you know, the error message, or the message is not particularly clear, but you know, about what it's trying to protect you from. But up-to-date systems and systems that have security software, those are the two things that you can do that will best protect you from websites that are actively malicious.
Thank you, Christopher. Now, I promise this is the very last question.
Oh, no, please, I love questions. Bring them on.
Which is just around if you've got any thoughts or information about how secure the WhatsApp app is, given the number of people that use it.
Okay, so give me 1 second to think. That's a really good question. That's put me on the spot there. So in general, what's, you know, in terms of the security of the app itself, you know, WhatsApp is backed by Facebook, I believe. You know, in terms of vulnerabilities and issues with the app itself, I have a reasonable degree of confidence in the app. I myself do not use WhatsApp. I've never used WhatsApp. What I will say is for messaging like that, I use an app called Signal. And let me emphasize what I'm about to say now. I'm moving into the realm of my personal opinion. I am not a fan of Facebook or WhatsApp in terms of their data privacy practices, and Signal has much better data privacy practices, and so that's one key reason that I use Signal rather than WhatsApp. The other part of the answer that I would give is that it also depends on what you're using it for. And here's what I mean by that. Security is ultimately about risk and risk assessment. And if I'm using WhatsApp to talk with a friend of mine who also lives in the United States, and we're talking about having dinner, I've got one set of risks. If I'm a human rights activist or a journalist in a repressive country, and I'm talking with my editor or leaders in another country, I've got a completely different set of risks, and those are much greater. And so WhatsApp may be fine for something that is lower risk, but not as fine for something that is higher risk.
Thank you, Christopher. I think that's really helpful, and I appreciate that. That's you're in the realms of your own views, but I do appreciate them, because I think sometimes when we hear people with a vast amount of knowledge, what they don't do is kind of say, well, this is what I kind of think about that, but it is my personal view. I do appreciate you giving us that view, because I think that's genuinely quite helpful.
Sure, my pleasure.
Thank you for your time. You've given more than the allotted time and answered lots of questions, which I'm really, really appreciative. We've had lots and lots of messages on the chat line saying that people that are leaving saying thank you, a really excellent presentation, and yeah, we've had lots and lots of those. I would, like I say, really, really like to thank you for all your time and expertise and sharing that with us. It's been really fun, and now we're getting loads and loads of thank you so much, brilliant, thank you so much, thank you so much. So they're just scrolling through.
Oh, fantastic.
Really
brilliant.
fantastic. So can I really thank you, Christopher? That's been a really interesting presentation. And
Great, thank you. And thank you and everyone for having me, and thank you everyone for joining. I hope this has been helpful, and maybe we can do this again sometime. I'd love the opportunity. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks everybody for listening. And again, thank you very much, Christopher. It's really appreciated.
Great.
And
Thank you.
good night to everybody. And as we said, the recording of this will be available on our website probably on Monday morning. So have a good weekend and stay safe.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher.
Thanks, Christopher.